So our first session this morning is our ECR grant and funding opportunities session. So we've got 3 speakers for you this morning. We have Professor Jason Sharples from UNSW Canberra, Professor Kate Miles from Uni of Melbourne, and Ed Barker from the University of Melbourne. And so they're going to take us through some of their tips, advice and experiences relating to grant funding and opportunities. Just as a brief intro, so Jason is a professor in applied maths at UNSW Canberra. He started life as a pure mathematician, doing his PhD in pure maths and mathematical physics. Over the last 10 to 15 years, he's built a research group in bushfire science and behaviour modelling at UNSW Canberra, and is now the director of the new UNSW bushfire research group there. He currently leads and has previously led several ARC and CRC projects, bushfire and natural hazard CRC projects. And he also currently sits on the ARC College of Experts, so plays a role in assessing all the grant applications that we willfully submit. Kate Smith-Miles is also a professor in applied maths, and she is the director of the ARC Industry Transformation Training Centre for Optimization Technologies, Integrated Methodologies and Applications. She's also the Associate Dean of Enterprise and Innovation for the Faculty of Science here at the University of Melbourne, and has also been awarded many grants, including 13 ARC grants in her time, and also has experience on the ARC College of Experts. And most recently, Kate's team has launched a new online research tool, which is a very cool application and culmination of about a decade of research, I believe. And so Ed is a PhD student at the School of Maths and Stats here at the University of Melbourne, and his research relates to designing new types of machine learning algorithms. And today he'll be talking to us about some of his most recent experiences in trying to commercialise some of that research. So some really kind of hands-on, on-the-ground advice and tips there. So we will start with Jason. I'll hand over to Jason now, and thank you to all our speakers, and thanks for everyone coming. So I stop sharing, and then Jason wants to share his screen. I'll hand over.
Okay, so 3, 2, let's try that. Okay, I think we're good. All right, so thanks, Rachel. Thanks for the opportunity to come and speak to everybody here about, I guess, just some of the tips along the way that I've picked up on how to be successful in attracting research funding. So I'll just start off just by giving you a bit of my background. So I've worked over quite a range of different research areas. If you look at the sort of pictorial representation of the way my career's gone, you can sort of view it as a slow descent from the heavens down into something more hellish. But throughout that sort of that descent, I've been able to attract research funding from a number of the areas that I've worked in. So the areas that I've gotten research funding from, well, quite a few. The ARC, of course, the Academy of Science, internal university grant schemes. I've been with the Bushfire CRC and now the Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC, and then these other ones. The philanthropic donations one's got an asterisk on it because I'm sort of still in the process of navigating that area. And the National Computational Infrastructure, I give it a little dagger because you're not actually really applying for money there, but you're applying for resources which have a sort of monetary equivalent. So just one thing to note is with all these different funding schemes, what that usually translates into is that you're going to have to learn to deal with different sort of different flavors to the way that these projects are run. So I mean, talking about something like the ARC is going to have a very different project structure to something like a CRC. Okay, so in particular for the CRC, you can expect that the level of reporting and other overheads that you're going to have to deal with are going to be quite different. A lot more reporting for these sort of more commercial enterprises, commercial grants that you get. Also, the level of engagement that you have to do with stakeholders can change quite a lot. There's almost none in an ARC discovery grant, or probably none most of the time. But for something like an industry grant, then you have to be spending a lot of time working with the stakeholders, keeping them happy and so on. And depending on those demands of your project, you may have to start thinking about project management and get some actual training in project management, which is something that's quite useful to do. Just from my, I guess, perspective from the other side of the funding scheme divide is, I think Rachel mentioned I'm on the ARC Council at the moment. I've been a detailed assessor for the ARC across various schemes. Also on the, I guess, the College of Experts equivalent in New Zealand, which is the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment, College of Expert Assessors, and I've also been involved in assessing grants for the EU and the UNSW in the US. So I guess overall, having sort of seen how these things work from both sides, it's given me a few tips, which I hopefully can pass on to you. Just for today, I tried to boil it down to 5, I guess, key things to be aware of. Number 1 is start small. I mean, you don't have to start small, but it's a good idea of getting your foot, a good way of getting your foot in the door and building up. Number 2 is being meticulous. Know your funding body, know your stakeholders, particularly if you're dealing with industry or commercial type schemes. And the last one, just to make the most of the support available to you. So I'll just spend a little bit of time just going into each of these. So starting off with start small, just give you a little bit of a timeline of sort of the grants I've got over the last 10 years. This is a non-linear timescale, you can all see. So when I first started trying to get grants, I was applying to the ARC, wasn't having much success. And there's almost this sort of feeling that's out there. It says, well, if you haven't won some money already, then why should we give you some? So to get around that, I thought, well, let's just start with something small. So my first grant that I actually got was, well, not the first one in the last 10 years. It was actually, it's a scheme that they don't have anymore, unfortunately, but the Academy of Science actually had this scheme where they would give you some money to travel to Europe and work with European scientists. Okay, good thing to do in just broadening your horizons and establishing research networks and collaborations, but also a good way to get the foot in the door to get some funding. Okay, so the funding there was about $10,000 just to spend 6 weeks overseas. So that was in 2010. I was then able to take that grant, go away to Europe and do some work, write that work up, and on the back of that, then you can apply for, the next one I applied for was a internal university UNSW internal grant. Okay, and it was about $50,000. Okay, so get that grant, do all the work, make sure you deliver on everything you said you were promising, and on the back of that, you leverage it, and was able to win my first ARC grant, so about $300K. On the back of that, again, just leveraging up, went to the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC, got a $1.4 million grant, and sort of where I'm at now is really trying to get these centre budgets funded, and we're looking at sort of tens of millions of dollars. So if you look at that over that sort of time frame, what's happened is there's been this sort of slow increase in the order of magnitude of funding that I'm applying for. Okay, so basically demonstrating that you can do good things with this level of money then gives people more faith that you're going to be able to do good things with the next order of magnitude up. So good idea just to start small and then leverage your way up to bigger numbers. So part of that leveraging, I sort of mentioned that you have to really deliver on your promises, and I think that's sort of what I want to talk about in this second point. Be meticulous in both your application and your delivery. So I've spoken a little bit about the delivery there, but also, I mean, I think as good researchers, you're being meticulous all the time. You shouldn't stop being meticulous when you go and do something like write a grant application. Okay, so when you write an application, make sure you do a good job of it. Okay, plan your project well and make sure that you write your application with a very well-defined and easy to understand program and structure. Okay, so if for nothing else, the reason you should do this is because as ARC college members, we literally read hundreds of applications, and I can tell you that after reading 50 or 60 applications, the well-written ones really stand out, which is what you want to do. Good idea to use definitive language. Okay, so try and use affirmative language as much as you can. It seems a bit strange, but you know, language does have this psychological effect on the people who are reading it. And if you're saying things like, well, if we sort of are successful in this part of the research, then we hope to go on and do this, sort of plants, you know, these perhaps subconscious seeds of doubts in the assessor's head. Whereas if you're saying, you know, when we deliver on this, then we will go on and we'll do this, it's just a slight change in language, but I guess the psychological effect it has is, you know, can really work in your advantage. So try and be definitive. And as I said before, when you get your research funding, make sure you deliver on the objectives as best as you can, because you can then use that as, you know, demonstrated success, which you can then use to help you get further grants. All right. Number 3, know your funding body. Okay, so a good idea, particularly with the ARC, is you can go onto the ARC website, Google the college members. There's quite a long list, but it's a really good idea to have some idea of who's on there. Okay, when your application goes through the ARC process, it gets assigned to a college member, 2 college members actually, first and second carriage. And so, you know, I've been in the position where I've been handling applications that are on, you know, subjects which are not entirely my field, not even close to my field in some cases, but I'm kind of the closest college member there is to be able to deal with this. So keep that in mind when you're writing your application. You know, you can probably take a good guess at, you know, 3 or 4 ARC college members who are likely to be the ones that are dealing with it. And, you know, keep in mind then that, well, perhaps somebody who's working in bushfire isn't going to understand your application about quantum electrodynamics if you go into all the you know, the details of it. So try and, you know, pitch your application at a level where someone's going to understand it. Good idea to try and understand the process. Okay, so I mentioned, you know, first and second carriage, college members who your application gets assigned to, but then there's also the whole process of it going out to detailed assessors, the College of Experts meeting and so on. So a good idea to go and talk to people who have an understanding of that process and get to know how it works. And a good idea, something I did early on, was to go to the research office at my university. They usually have files of successful ARC applications, and you can just sit down and read them. Okay, read and learn from them. You'll sort of start to see patterns for the types of applications which are successful, the tricks they use, the way these things are structured, and so on. So a good idea to go and learn from them. It's more for the industry-focused or more commercially focused funding schemes. Know your stakeholders. Okay, so often with these schemes, you're going to be working with external partners, also for things like ARC linkage. So really take the time to understand what your stakeholders need. Sometimes researchers make the mistake, I think, of just going in to the stakeholders and saying, well, this is what you guys need. Sometimes that's not what they need. Okay? You need to sort of be a little bit humble and just listen. You know, try and establish those relationships, even to the point where you might want to even try and get to know your stakeholders personally. Okay, I know that I've had some of my most fruitful moments have been sitting down with stakeholders over a beer or a dinner or something like that, and just you know, getting to know them, understanding what their needs are on that deeper level. And also a good idea to try and understand, I guess, how the importance of your stakeholders to the project that you've got in mind, or the funding scheme you've got in mind. Okay, so not all stakeholders are going to be equally as important as each other. So a really good idea to try and work out which ones are going to be the most important to you and foster good relations with them. And the last tip is just to make the most of the support available to you. So if you haven't already, get to know your research office. Okay, go along, take a packet of biscuits or something, sit down, have a cup of coffee with them and talk about your research. Let them know what you're doing, okay? Let them know why what you're doing matters and why it should be funded. Okay, these people are there to help you in this process. Also a good idea to get to know your media and comms team. Okay, they can help you get your message out. If you've done a really nice piece of research that you think people should know about, go and talk to them. You might end up doing a media release, and then that's the sort of thing that you can work into an application to show that your research is having impact. So yeah, as I said, these people are really there to help you find funding opportunities. They'll read your proposals and give you feedback on what you've done right, what you could improve on. They'll help you establish partnerships, all that sort of stuff. So a really good resource. I know certainly early on, I didn't make the most of them as I probably should have. I talk to them all the time now. So I think that's about all I had. A lot of other things I could go into, but I think, when I think about it, they're the 5 sort of most important lessons I've learned along the way. So I'll stop sharing now.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. That's great. I think what we will do is move straight on to Kate and Ed, and then we'll try and do a good 20-minute chat and questions at the end. So Kate, take it away.
Yeah, I'd like to share my screen, but it says the host is disabled.
Oh, sorry. Here you go. Hopefully you should be able to do that now.
Yeah, great. Okay, let me know if you can see my screen. Or when you can see my screen.
It's loading. There it is.
Okay, cool. So I have 2 slides, but there's a lot of detail on each slide. So let me just say that this is a diagram that I've mocked up in my capacity as Associate Dean for the Faculty of Science to try to explain all the many ways that researchers try to have impact and the ways that you can work with external partners to achieve that impact. So it's got 4 quadrants. So the first quadrant here is your classical, we're all doing this, right? We're all researchers trying to have impact by doing curiosity-driven research where we generate new knowledge in the form of discoveries, and that has impact that I'll call scholarly impact. But there's many other kinds of impact that we can all achieve as researchers. So I'm going to talk you through the 4 quadrants of this cycle and then overlay on that the funding opportunities that are available to support you on that journey. So the focus here is very much on external impact beyond the academy. Having said that, of course, there's ARC Discovery and DECRA to support the scholarly impact. But suppose you do some scholarly research and you generate some new knowledge and you publish your nice papers. It doesn't just have to end there. That new knowledge that you've generated gets added into the corpus of existing knowledge that we already have out there so that others can adopt it. So that's a form of impact that I'll call translational impact. How do we achieve that? In some sense, when we work in a university, we are custodians for this knowledge. People come to us because they know we know the existing stuff, the centuries of research, but we also are generating new knowledge all the time. We have some responsibility to kind of curate that knowledge, to train other people in that knowledge, and to try, if appropriate, to commercialize that so that it can be adopted by others, with or without us. If we just put it out there through patents and other tools that people can purchase, then it can have impact. But many times people don't want to just translate our stuff themselves. They want to engage with us to achieve that. So suppose we have industry challenges where industry comes and asks us questions. Now we might call them consulting questions, where they're actually trying to tap into what we already know how to do. I've come to the university because you are experts in something, and I have a question that the industry doesn't know how to answer, but we think you do. And so let's just put that on the chart here, that there are consulting opportunities where industry is tapping into our existing knowledge. And that's the kind of impact we can have. We can transform the way they do things by making sure they adopt best practice. But the most interesting quadrant is the last one, where existing knowledge, so I should just say I've got the little word push up here. So this is where science researchers are coming up with their own research that they want to pursue. You're curious about it. And we are supporting people to push that knowledge through to have all kinds of impact out in the world, right? And that's where your business development team are there to understand the work you've done. Your marketing communications team can understand it and promote the work and try to find uptake. But there's another quadrant, and that's where the questions that are being posed by industry or business, government, not-for-profit, society in general, the questions that are being asked cannot be answered by existing knowledge. We don't know how to answer them. They are industry-driven or externally driven research questions. And they are coming into us, and it's a question of whether we find them curious. If we have our curiosity sparked, then the cycle continues. We now have curiosity-driven science questions that will generate new knowledge. And so you can see why it's a cycle, where on this side, we actually have industry pulling, driving questions that might perpetuate the cycle. So I call that kind of impact sort of sustaining impact. It keeps the cycle going. What are these questions? You know, these are genuine research questions. It's not consulting. They're genuine research questions that are being posed by someone from the outside, where your curiosity is sparked. You think that existing knowledge can't handle it, and you've got an opportunity to do something new and interesting. So that's a cycle of many ways that we can all achieve impact. And we're all on here somewhere. And you've got your business development team at all the universities that are hopefully working to support you moving around that cycle if you wish to engage in more than quadrant one. So I found this to be a useful diagram to help get the business development people seeing from an academic perspective what we're trying to achieve and the many ways that we can support researchers. Now, where do funding opportunities come in this? So over in the first quadrant then, where it's just, you know, fundamental research and curiosity-driven questions, not necessarily with an external partner. Of course, we have ARC Discovery and DECRA. I've already shared the YouTube link in the chat there about what Jason and I have experienced in Canberra at the College of Experts, and what the important things are when you put in a strong application for Discovery or DECRA. Around the second quadrant, this is where the university, all universities I'm pretty sure, have funding and support available to help you take your new knowledge and push it out there so that people can experience uptake of your research. Whether it's helping you develop workshops, so you train industry in your new techniques, whether it's proof of concept funding, where you might have some very nice results that you've just published in a top journal paper in quadrant one. But if you just did a little bit more work to be able to demonstrate how an industry partner could use that, then you could maybe have a conversation with an industry partner, right? So the university probably has some schemes. I know University of Melbourne does, called proof of concept funding at various levels. We have one at the Faculty of Science level, small pots of money. We also have a university proof of concept fund for maybe $50,000 to $100,000 to work for a few months demonstrating the potential, the patentability or the potential commercialization of your idea. Universities will often fund patent applications and often organize events where you have an opportunity, if they know about you, if you've gone through some of the training programs, and I know Ed will talk next about some of the programs he's been through, but every now and again they'll have an event where you have an opportunity to pitch to a bunch of venture capitalists who might want to invest in what you're doing. Round in the third quadrant though, the consulting area, the kinds of consulting questions, I really encourage people to start thinking, perhaps there's sometimes a tendency to feel quite negative about this, like industries ask this question, I'm actually not interested, don't care in helping them make more money. But there are many ways that this can be a stepping stone to other things. So we have a few mechanisms for how you can get funding to deliver answers to industry based on stuff that you probably already know how to do. There's contract research. Any organization can enter into a contract research agreement with you. And then there are specific ones that you can apply for competitively. For instance, Defence Science Technology Group has usually strategic research initiatives where they call for applications and you get a research contract. Innovations Connections is a government scheme where industry goes to them and says, we have this research question, we need help. And the government will often put $50,000 on the table that goes to the university to get a researcher to work with an industry partner. And then there's the former AMSI internship, now APR intern program, where as a supervisor, you get a certain amount of money. I can't remember if it's $3,000 or $5,000 just to supervise a PhD student working on an industry project for a few months. And it's, I'll talk more about that on the next slide. And then finally, if you actually are working with an industry partner and the questions are genuine research questions, not consulting, then you have a chance of putting in for a linkage application. You won't get a linkage grant if it looks like consulting. It's got to have some genuine research questions that benefit more than just that industry partner, but make a broader impact to society. The industry partner is just being very generous in giving you what you need, co-funding and giving some data or whatever, so that you can do some research that will benefit more than just them, but of course they gain as well. There's CRCs over in this quadrant and of course the ARC training centres and hubs. So there are a range of funding opportunities. What I want to do in my last minute is share with you some of my experience, a few pathways. So I've just named 4 companies up here that I've had long-term collaborations with over the last few decades, a couple of decades. So here's an example, ceramic fuel cells. I agreed to supervise an intern, an AMSI intern. I didn't know anything about the topic. It was how do we manufacture ceramic fuel cells more efficiently. It was an optimization problem, but it was one of these nasty optimization problems where you couldn't write down the analytical expression. So I didn't know how to solve it. That's fine. It opened up the door for us to learn about black box optimization techniques. We had a successful internship. The PhD student then helped us write the ARC linkage grant. They gave her a job at the company. She became the PI on the linkage grant. We worked for 3 years. We got some nice R packages that we developed and some expertise. And, you know, I gave some keynote talks on black box optimization and sort of established myself as an expert in this area because of this experience. Many years later, I'm having conversations with Boeing and AGL about their black box optimization problems, that if I hadn't had that experience, I would have said, oh, I don't know how to solve that problem. There are others. I've done a couple of these innovation connections projects. They used to be called Researchers in Business, but now it's Innovation Connections, that also led to ARC linkage grants. Because the point is, and some contract research that led to linkage grants, the point is in the initial engagement, whatever style it is, where you work for a short period of time, you're trying to establish a true collaboration, understand their problem. And once you've got that and you've got evidence of that, then you can apply for a linkage grant. The outcomes of the linkage grant would include things like, you know, in many cases, these industry partners filed provisional patents based on the work we had done. There were definitely new methodologies developed, definitely publications, definitely after working for a few years on a problem, you know, it gives you the fodder to go around when you get invited to give a talk somewhere. You can talk about that, and you can establish expertise that you otherwise would not necessarily have had the opportunity to develop. So as Rachel mentioned at the beginning, we've just recently got sort of $8 million to establish this Optima training centre. Well, we have all these industry partners, but these industry partners have come on board because we have the expertise that came from engaging with some of these projects that just started with will I supervise a student on a topic I don't know anything about? Sure, I'm happy to learn new things all the time. So I encourage you to talk to your business development team about how to get started with some of these initial things. It's like Jason was saying, start small, it leads to bigger things. And that's probably where I will stop.
Thank you, Kate. That's an excellent diagram. Very great to see it all summed up in one page, which is great. All right, so let's move on to Ed, and then we will have some questions at the end. Over to you, Ed.
Thanks, Rachel. You can hear me okay?
Yep.
People can see that?
Yep. Go for it.
Okay, well, thanks for inviting me to talk, Rachel. So my name's Ed, and I'm a part-time PhD student at the University of Melbourne. I'm going to be talking about funding AI research, funding research generally through commercialisation as a potential alternative perhaps to government funding. So just about me, I'm a part-time PhD student. My full-time job is as a data scientist. So I did my master's in mathematics at the University of Melbourne as well, where I specialised in probability and statistics. So I'm currently doing a PhD, and my area of research is called reinforcement learning, which is a type of machine learning. So most of my presentation is going to be focused on AI, but hopefully there'll be kind of takeaways generally. Now, the main reason that I'm talking to you today is that about a year and a half ago, I founded a startup company. And the intention behind that is that the company can form a vehicle for commercializing some of the research that I've been doing. So I'm basically just going to share with you some of my experiences setting that up and some of my experiences to date. So it's still relatively early days in terms of the commercialization process, but hopefully you still find some of my experiences interesting. So I thought it would just be worthwhile really quickly just providing a little bit of context. So I just did a little bit of research before the presentation to look at where funding for AI research comes from. Now, there's a lot of figures on this slide, but there's a couple of interesting takeaways, I think. One is that there's probably more private investment at the moment into AI research globally than government investment. So these first two figures, that $16.8 billion figure is just venture capital investment into AI-related startups. Simultaneously, there's obviously a lot of AI investment happening at the big tech companies, particularly in the US. Now, that said, there is still a lot of interest in this area from government, particularly in the last sort of kind of 5 to 10 years. So I've just got some figures from governments kind of across the world. As you can see, probably Australia is not at the head of the pack in terms of AI funding specifically. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting any takeaways from this, and it doesn't mean that the only way to kind of get funding for this type of research is to go get a job at Google or make a startup or go overseas, but it's helpful context, I think. The other kind of high level point that I think is interesting is that a lot of cutting edge research in AI comes with a pretty hefty price tag. So probably the most famous bit of research in AI from the last 5 to 10 years was where researchers at a subsidiary of Google managed to create an algorithm that was able to beat the world's best Go player. Now, it's impossible to determine exactly how much that research cost, but commentators have suggested that even just running the computer training to generate the results from one of the key papers that Google published could cost an independent research group as much as $35 million. So it can be really expensive. That's not at all to suggest that all AI kind of research is expensive, but some of the cutting edge stuff can be really quite expensive. And that's kind of driven home by, so the same subsidiary that was responsible for that piece of research, a large part of their focus at the moment is developing AI algorithms that can play video games. So this is 3 of their kind of most high profile bits of research. But they operated at about a $500 million loss last year, which was all bankrolled by Google. So that's just a little bit of a context and a bit of scene setting in terms of research in AI. So why did I consider commercializing some of the research that I've been doing? Well, kind of answering that question depends a lot about the details of the research that I'm doing, but there's 2 really important factors that went into that decision for me. The first one is that, and I knew this even before kind of I started doing research in this area, but reinforcement learning is an area that has a lot of potential industrial applications. So there's a huge amount of interest at the moment in terms of applying this technology to real world problems relating to things like optimization. So like specific examples would be things like supply chain management, job scheduling, dealing with energy distribution networks, things like cloud computing. So there's a lot of research being published at the moment, which is evidence that these kinds of tools have real world applications. The second critical thing was that the early experiments that we did suggested that and just for context, a large part of my research is focused on designing new types of reinforcement learning algorithms. So we obtained early evidence that suggested that the algorithms that we were developing had a real technological edge over what was out there already. So those were kind of like the two critical factors that led me down this path. But as for why I decided to pursue commercialization, I mean, a really big part of it was and continues to be the idea that with external funding, it will be a good way to fund future research, kind of along similar lines to what I've been researching so far. So in terms of kind of my first steps down this pathway, after I felt that I had something that was worthwhile pursuing from a commercialization angle, the first thing I did, obviously, was have kind of some discussions with my supervisors and also the commercialization part of the university. Now, a kind of key takeaway from me from that was that universities are seeking to commercialize technology constantly. So no one was surprised by the suggestion that I put forward, that it was worthwhile looking at commercialization potential. And in fact, it was something that I was encouraged to pursue. And I found that there was a lot of people throughout the university, and this is the University of Melbourne, but I'm sure it would apply to any uni in Australia, that were there to provide kind of advice and support in terms of the best steps to kick something like this off. The nature of the commercialization pathway that I'm exploring is that patents are likely to be quite important. So we're probably going to try to seek to patent the new algorithms that we've developed. So a couple of really interesting and important takeaways from those early discussions is that if you're a student, then you own any IP that you develop as part of your, for example, your PhD or your master's. If you're an employee, then the university will own the IP, but you will be entitled to a share of the revenue generated by the IP, assuming that it does at some point generate revenue. And there's all sorts of kind of complex arrangements that you can create if you're the inventor. If you're also an employee, for example, it's possible to kind of create an exclusive license so that you can commercialize technology that you developed, even though the university owns the intellectual property. It's worthwhile noting that if you want to protect something with a patent globally, you're probably looking at a price tag of up to $100,000. So it can be quite expensive. So if you're looking to do something like that and the university doesn't own the patent, then you need to secure funding from somewhere. Now, this might be something that everyone in the audience is already completely aware of, but it's extremely important. And that is that if you're developing research and you think you have something that's potentially patentable, then it's really critical that you explore the potential to patent before you publish. Because if you publish your findings, so for example, if you publish the new algorithm that you've designed, then you can't actually patent it later. So that's something really critical to keep in mind. In terms of other first steps, so I found a collaborator, so Jonathan, a former colleague of mine. I convinced him to help me on the project. And then another really important first step for us was enrolling in an accelerator program. So at the moment, we're enrolled in a program called TRAM, which is offered by the University of Melbourne. Now, I guess different accelerators can offer different things. So the TRAM program has been really, really helpful for us because the TRAM program is focused kind of specifically on scientific researchers trying to translate their research into commercial ventures. So it's a really nice fit for us. The University of Melbourne also has accelerator programs. So for example, there's the MAP program and there's one run by the Wade Institute, I think. Now they're less focused on translating scientific research. So if you're interested in kind of finding an accelerator program, they're probably not all the same. So it's worthwhile finding one that is a good fit for what you're doing. But we found it extremely helpful because, you know, we're technicians principally. So they've been able to give us a lot of the kind of basic business skills that you need in order to assess the viability of your technology. And it can also function as a really great motivator. So in terms of where we're at the moment, I mean, the really critical question that you have to answer when you're kind of in the early stages of commercialization is, you know, do I have something that's commercially valuable? So is someone prepared to pay for my research? So that's really been our focus over the last 12 months. As part of the accelerator that we're doing, we've interviewed sort of almost 100 different potential customers to find out what their needs are, what they're interested in. We want to determine whether they're prepared to pay for the stuff that we're working on. And even more importantly, you know, if they're prepared to pay, are they prepared to pay enough so that we'll have something that is commercially viable at the end of the day? Now, assuming that, well, at the moment, what we're doing is we're running 3 separate trials with volunteer companies to kind of assess the question of whether our technology will actually deliver a benefit on the ground, so to speak. So we're kind of working with those sort of potential future customers to get a sense of the problems that we might encounter in the real world, and also get a little bit of kind of commercial feedback. So assuming all goes well, then there's a lot of different pathways that companies can take in terms of turning their research and their prototype into an actual commercial product. I probably won't talk through all of these in detail, but we've explored, or at least considered, each of these different points in time. It really depends on the nature of the technology that you're trying to commercialize. So we're looking at developing software which is kind of built around the algorithms that we've designed. And what that means is that building a product is not expensive. So we're most likely to explore the third option, which is where we don't actually go to private investors and ask for large injections of cash. Rather, we kind of do the work ourselves to find some initial customers, and then use kind of some early revenue to build out the product so that we've got something that we can roll out more widely. But you know, these are kind of different options that are available, and we're kind of still at the process of assessing the validity of our product. So I mean, that's kind of the main things that I wanted to cover. But I just thought I'd quickly share some reflections based on where we've come to so far. So I have found that exploring commercial pathways can be occasionally a distraction from underlying research. It does take quite a bit of time, particularly in the early stages. For me, you know, the principal driver is the actual underlying research. So it can be frustrating when you have to worry about, you know, preparing pitch decks and, you know, like interviewing customers and stuff like that. So that's kind of like maybe a negative, but then there's also a couple of really big positives. One is that it's really helped us focus our research on problems that are relevant. So, you know, from an applied science perspective, there's really no better feedback than going to an end customer and finding out whether it actually makes their job easier or whether it does a better job than alternative technologies that exist. And also, I found it's a really fantastic opportunity to learn skills and to deal with problems that I might not have encountered otherwise, and to really broaden my horizon. So far, I found it a really kind of challenging but rewarding experience. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to cover today. But yeah, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, so if you want to stop sharing, that's fine. Anyway, so let's go to some questions. We have a couple in the chat, and then I'll open it up to the floor. The first is from Jason White, and this links, I think, directly to how Ed kind of just finished his talk, so it fits nicely. He writes, I would like to unpack the start small, it leads to bigger things idea, as this is surely made easier if you avoid a dead-end project, wrestling over IP control and so on. So any tips on anticipating and avoiding pitfalls, particularly if you have an industry partner who might not quite get how you fit together and things. So maybe Ed could chat to that a little bit before we go back how you finish your talk before we go to Jason and Kate's ideas on that?
Sorry, Rachel, I might just need to digest that question. But
Okay.
which one were you referring to? The one from Jason White?
Jason White. So you know, how do you kind of pick your project pathways to try and minimize your dead ends, I suppose, is the bigger question. Do Kate or Jason want to jump in on that?
I'm happy to answer from my perspective, but just quickly. So I mean, I think that that is really one of the key concerns when you actually start an accelerator program. So the key question that they want to answer is, you know, is this something worth pursuing? And they want to get that answer as quickly as possible. And I think that one of the key bits of advice that we had is that the first thing you need to do is, in terms of the commercial project, is talk to as many customers as possible so that you know that you're working on something that's going to be of value at the end of the day. Because if you are spending a lot of time and investing a lot of effort into building something that no one wants to use, then you can be wasting a lot of time. So that's kind of like a really strong focus, at least in the kind of the programs that we've been doing. But that's kind of, I guess, a commercialization perspective.
I'll just say I've had loads of dead ends, loads of industry projects that went nowhere. And, you know, it's all just part of experience. I realize people want to shortcut that and avoid it. And that's what the question was, how to spot it early and avoid it. But many times you can't avoid it. You've already committed to work with an industry partner that doesn't really understand what mathematics is. They're asking you to do things that are not interesting at all. And you just do it quickly and get out of there if you don't see it going anywhere. But, you know, I think there's always opportunity. So it may not be an opportunity for you, but it's an opportunity for one of your PhD students, for instance, to do some work, to get a job, to do some work that might lead to them being offered employment, or it might lead to, you know, a foot in the door of the company to explore more genuinely interesting questions. Yeah. So
Jason White clarifies, how do you make sure that the question asked by the industry partner is what they actually want answered? So Jason, can you talk to this?
That's part of your job, right? Is to help them clarify, because sometimes they don't have the language to understand what they could be asking as well.
Yeah, I mean, that comes back to what I was saying about establishing good communication and good sort of rapport with your partners. I mean, you know, I would say from my experience with some of the industry people I've worked with in the CRC project is, you know, it became clear, you know, halfway through the project that, you know, the industry partner wasn't exactly sure what they wanted answered. And so you sort of allow for that sort of as the project evolves, you know, maybe the scope shifts a little bit. You don't want it to creep too far. But, you know, you work with them along the way. You keep them informed of what you're doing. You talk to them about what you think, you know, some of the key research problems, and help them try and see that, but also listen to them to really understand what their problems are, what their real problems they're trying to deal with are, and you know, work through a way that's you're gonna be able to address that the best way possible. But it's all about just, you know, maintaining those good relationships with them.
Great.
And sometimes it's an opportunity for them. They don't know about all your research and all the other things you're doing, and you go in to answer their question, but you have the opportunity to share with them what you're also working on and say, actually, now I know your problem. Have you considered this? Have you considered that? And sometimes you can interest them to get involved in something they hadn't initially thought of.
Great. So the next question is about the timeframes and time commitments of particularly applying for funding. So Hon asks, what is an appropriate timeframe to spend applying for grants and funding opportunities, particularly in the context of short-term postdocs? So he actually references a 2-year postdoc, but for example, I'm on a 1-year postdoc contract at the moment. So by the time you actually do the research and settle into a new place, how much time do you have to commit to grant applications and so on? And Adelaide adds in there, if you're an early career lecturer, you've also got to fit in your teaching commitments and so on. And all of those commitments, particularly in our new normal, are getting greater and more or tighter, if you like. And so if you got any advice or suggestions, tips, experience on how to essentially how to fit it all in under the pressure of what feels like a short period of time.
I would say this, regardless of whether you think your chances are good, you know, you look at ARC acceptance rates and you think, oh, what's the point in applying for a DECRA? Regardless of whether you think you're going to get it, it's always very valuable, especially if you're an ECR and you've just finished your PhD and you have all these, do I continue with my PhD research? Was there a different direction I want to go? Everyone periodically should be sitting down and writing a DECRA or a laureate or a future fellow kind of application, regardless of whether you think you're going to submit it or you think it's going to get funded. Everybody needs to have a plan for what they want to be doing with their research for the next 5 years. Whether you can convince someone to fund it is another matter, but you have to be clear in your mind about what you're passionate about and what the questions are that's going to drive your research. If you've done that work, if you've put the effort into something that'll look like a pretty strong DECRA application, regardless of whether it gets funded or not, it's something you have that you can then, when you apply for your next job, you can say to the interview panel, this is what I'm passionate about. This is what my research is about. When I got my laureate, I thought, I had a blank piece of paper and I thought, I don't know, it was like a fork in the road moment. I'd had so many different projects and I was feeling very split. And I thought, what do I actually care about? And I blank notepad and I just wrote down what I actually think is important to address. That turned into my laureate. I didn't think I was going to get it. But it was my plan. It was my work plan for the next 5 years. And I really encourage everyone to put together a DECRA application, a convincing DECRA that hopefully you submit. But even if it doesn't get funded, that's your plan.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I can just add, I think, you know, most ECRs have realised that this whole idea of a 35-hour contract working as an academic is a bit of a well, it's not the reality. You know, putting together a really good ARC application, I would say, you know, just as a rough number, it's 3 months of work, and you know, sometimes you have to go above and beyond and try and fit that in around other things. But you know, as Kate said, the more you get your head in the space of writing these sorts of things, the better you get at them. And you know, even if you put in a grant which is unsuccessful, then you can go and talk to your research office about it. They'll give you advice on what didn't work. You'll get feedback from detailed assessors about what didn't work and so on. So it's just a good thing just to you know, get your hands dirty with.
So given that we are now in an era of a new normal, leading on from that, how do you think the landscape might change, or you don't think it will change? How do you think we might need to adapt, particularly in the shorter term, in the next year or two, as things are immediately a bit different due to the pandemic?
Well, can I just say the immediate obvious thing is that the government has shifted ARC funding more towards linkage instead of discovery. So the pathways that I was showing, where you have some initial industry contact, small scale, supervise an internship, do one of these innovation connections thing, whatever, establish some kind of rapport with a partner to apply for a linkage grant. You know, when you put in a linkage grant, it can actually cover a lot of the fundamental research you want to do, as long as it's flavored towards some kind of societal impact that the industry partner can benefit from. Some of my linkage proposals have actually been quite not related to the industry partners' questions. Some of the questions are, but there's some components in there that are just more long-term. And I think with the funding shift, everyone should be thinking, unless you work in some absolutely pure fundamental area that has no relationship whatsoever to anything. But even if you're a topologist, you know, get involved in some data science kind of questions or dimension reduction techniques, or, you know, sometimes just sending one of your PhD students to go and do an internship for a bit is a foot in the door for you to think about ways that you could contribute to some industry problems.
I guess one of the tricks I've sort of used recently is, well, first bit of advice, get to know how big the budgets of your school, your faculty and so on are, and understand that if you can sort of work with numbers that are around about 1% of that budget, that's tend to be perceived as noise. And so you can actually sort of get away with, you know, just going up and asking for those sorts of figures. And I guess that's something I've done in the past, was just to go to, you know, the school or the faculty, the dean, and just say, look, if you give me this much, or if I can get this much money from an industry partner, will you match it? That's a very, very easy way of just doubling your money. And, you can then get enough money to sort of hire a research assistant for 3 or 6 months and just help you, start to get the momentum of getting your research out there.
Thanks, Jason. So we have a couple of questions from Adelaide, which I did miss one earlier on. Sorry, Mel. The first is wondering how ECRs with family responsibilities who perhaps can't work outside that 9 to 5, any advice on how they can remain competitive in this very competitive and increasingly competitive environment? And perhaps linked to what we've just talked about, another part of the question is looking at other funding pathways, given that the ARC rates are so low, the other particularly non-industry funding pathways that are out there in terms of perhaps Jason could talk to the CRC or NHMRC and so on. Any comments on either of those two questions?
Can I just address the family responsibility stuff? So obviously we have ROPE and the College of Experts members are always on the lookout for assessors that didn't adequately consider someone's personal circumstances, etc. Obviously the most compelling ROPE case is before I had career interruptions, I was a superstar, and then I've clearly had some interruptions and my time available is less now. But, for the next 3 years, if you give me this money, I can carve out the time because, same with illness, right? That people want to see that before something happened, you were great. Something's happened, they accept that, but they also want to see that you have the capacity to deliver if they invest in you. That's the ideal situation. Not everyone has been fortunate enough to be able to demonstrate they were a superstar before they had the interruptions. I think there are many other schemes that you can apply for if you've always struggled to find the time. And so, for instance, I know at universities I've worked at, there are schemes that people with family responsibilities can apply for to get, and through the Australian Maths Society, for instance, that can help you bring your kids to a conference or can help you pay for a babysitter. If you have to go and pick up your kids from something at a certain time, you can actually pay somebody else to do that so that you can do your research. All sorts of schemes are available within universities and the AustMS. Oh, sorry, and one more thing with COVID. Most universities, I know University of Melbourne is, and I expect other universities are very conscious of early career researchers and especially people with family responsibilities, and especially women have been impacted more by COVID than others. And so there are various schemes. We have schemes where if you can demonstrate that COVID has severely disrupted your research plans, you can apply for funding. We've had something this year called the Albert Schumann's. We've used trust funds to extend people's contracts and things like that because of COVID. Most universities, if they're not currently thinking about this, please lobby them. Say universities like University of Melbourne have schemes. What are you doing? How can you use some trust funds, for instance, to introduce some temporary support schemes that might enable a postdoc to extend their contract by 6 months because of interruptions.
That's great, thank you, Kate. And ASEMS is also starting to work in that space, and we obviously have our session on Thursday in that as well. If it's now 10:30, we're meant to have a 10-minute break now. If people want to stay, then we can continue with some questions, if that's okay, or head off and grab a cup of tea before the presentation start at 10:40. But I do want to perhaps throw the other side of the question to Jason in terms of non-ARC funding, perhaps your CRC experience, for example, just for a few more minutes and then we'll finish up.
Yeah, I mean, the CRC is kind of a blessing and a curse, if I put it that way. It's a lot less competitive, a lot less involved in applying for research funding and bigger pool of money to go for. So that's all good. The overheads in terms of project management are significant though. I mean, I think if I thought about it, I would actually be saying I'm probably spending half a day a week just, managing the project. Project management is nothing I ever got any training in. I've sort of had some training subsequently, but that was a real, I guess, something that I hadn't really factored in, and it does affect the amount of research you can do. So just be aware of that. Also with the CRC, there's a hell of a lot of stakeholder engagement. I mean, that's literally written into my project deliverables that I'm meant to go and have these, monthly meetings and reporting, quarterly reports and so on. The stakeholders are sort of, front of mind in terms of the CRC, in terms of these are the people we need to be keeping happy. And, I guess there was a bit of a transition for me to go from someone who was more just, focused on doing their own pure research to someone who actually now had to try and, work with a bunch of other people who, didn't really come from that research space at all. So that was kind of difficult to begin with, but over the years, just sort of building on those relationships, getting to know these people personally, it becomes a whole lot more productive in the end, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we will probably wrap up there to let people go and get a coffee before the next talks, but I'd like to say a big thank you to all three of our speakers today. Thank you for taking the time to come and give us some excellent advice, excellent tips and experiences from the three of you. We'll have a 10-minute break now for our chats, for our tea, and then we'll be back for our ECR and student presentations at 10:40. So thank you all very much.